Welcome to SnoozyTor. Here the world slows down. The stories we tell aren't about heroes or glory, but about the quiet lives that hold the world together when no one's watching. In tonight's story, The Carpenter of Dust, we follow a man named Sam, a builder who loses everything during the Great Depression, and learns piece by piece how to rebuild not just houses, but faith, forgiveness, and the meaning of tomorrow. It's a story about fathers and sons, about the letters that travel farther than miles, and the small things that outlive us, like trees and kindness and love that never asks to be returned. So take a deep breath, let the noise fade, and if you can, listen with your heart as you drift towards sleep, because sometimes the softest stories are the ones that stay. This is SnoozyTor, and this is The Carpenter of Dust. I remember the day the machines went silent. The air in the carpentry shop hung thick with the smell of oil and sawdust, like the ghost of better years. One by one, the men stopped their work, hands still resting on hammers, saws mid-cut, breath held. Mr. Halpern, our foreman, stepped out of the office with his hat in his hands. That was how we knew it was over. A man never holds his hat that way unless he's about to bury something. He said the factory was closing. Orders stopped coming in. The company couldn't keep up with its debts. That was the word for everything back then. Debts. Not just the kind you owed the bank, but the kind life seemed to collect from you, piece by piece. When I walked home that afternoon, the winter wind came straight off Lake Michigan, biting through my coat. My wife, Mary, met me at the door. I didn't have to say a thing. She just looked at me, and I saw it in her eyes, the same quiet fear that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. That night, we ate the last of the canned beans, and I promised her I'd find work again soon. A promise made more out of habit than hope. Days turned into weeks. I stood in lines that stretched around corners, men like me holding resumes no one wanted to read. Every morning the news spoke of another bank collapse, another factory shuttered. You could hear the hunger in people's voices before you saw it in their faces. When Mary got sick that February, there wasn't money for the doctor. I sold my tools one by one to pay for medicine that didn't work. After she was gone, I packed what was left of my life into a canvas bag and left Chicago behind. I didn't have a destination, just the direction of the sun, west. Someone had said there was work in Arizona, government jobs, new projects under Roosevelt's programs. The Works Progress Administration, they called it. Those 3 words sounded like a miracle. Have you ever walked through a town that looked like it forgot how to breathe? Every stop along the way was the same. Boarded up windows, broken signs, silence where laughter used to live. Men huddled under bridges, cooking onions over tin fires. Children with dust on their cheeks and no shoes. You could almost hear the land itself sighing, tired of watching people break. At night, when the stars came out, I'd lie awake and listen to the wind. It sounded like the ocean I'd never seen, endless, restless, carrying whispers from lives better than mine. Sometimes I'd find a scrap of wood, whittle it into the shape of a house, and carve my name into it. Samuel Reed. Just to remind myself I still existed. One night, near the border of New Mexico and Arizona, I met an old man sitting by a campfire. His name was Heinrich. He said he'd come from Germany, long before the men with uniforms started marching there. You Americans, he told me, you think this is the end of the world. But endings are just another kind of beginning. The question is, beginning of what? I didn't know how to answer. But that night, as the flames flickered across his face, I realized something. Maybe the work I was looking for wasn't just about money or survival. Maybe it was about building something worth living for again. When I finally reached Phoenix, the desert was blooming, a strange thing to see life sprouting from a place so dry. I found a sign outside a workshop. Laborers needed, WPA project. My hands trembled as I walked in, the way they used to before touching fine wood. They gave me a hammer, a lunch ticket, and a day's wage. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight of something other than loss. I felt purpose. Sometimes I think of that day as the first breath after drowning. The world hadn't changed. The pay was small, the sun was cruel, and I still slept in a rented room that smelled of mildew. But as I fell asleep that night, I whispered to the darkness, "Tomorrow I build again." Tell me, if you had lost everything, your home, your family, your faith, would you have found the strength to start over? Or would you have let the dust take you too? The desert has its own kind of silence. It's not the emptiness of nothing, but the hush of something waiting, a pause before life decides whether to continue. When I first walked into that silence, I still carried the weight of cities on my back. The sound of machines that no longer worked. The smell of smoke that no longer meant warmth. Arizona's roads were long ribbons of dust, stretching farther than my hope could see. Each morning I followed the railroad tracks. The trains that passed looked like iron ghosts, full of soldiers, travelers, dreamers, and the desperate. Some waved as they vanished into the heat. Others just stared, the way people do when they're afraid their reflection might look back. I wasn't alone on those roads. There were families pushing carts, old men carrying sacks, women with children half asleep in their arms. The air shimmered with heat and hunger. When the wind blew, it carried not the sound of leaves, but of prayers whispered into empty hands. One afternoon, I stopped at a roadside diner long since abandoned. Its sign still read "Home Cooking," 2 words that hurt to look at. Inside, the windows were cracked, the floorboards scattered with dust and mouse bones. I found an old coffee tin under the counter, half filled with coins. Pennies mostly. I left them there. Some things felt too sacred to steal, even from ghosts. That night, I built a small fire behind the diner. A young boy appeared from the shadows, no older than 12. His shirt hung off him like a flag torn by wind. He didn't speak at first, just watched the flames like they were the only real thing left. Finally he asked, "Mister, you got food?" I handed him half of what I had, a crust of bread, 2 dried apples. He ate slow, careful, as if each bite had to last longer than hunger. When he was done, he whispered, "My pa went looking for work. Ain't come back yet." I asked how long it had been. He said, 3 weeks. We sat in silence for a while. Then he looked at me, eyes wide and hollow. "You think God still remembers this place?" What could I tell him? That I wasn't sure if God remembered anyone anymore? Instead I said, if he forgot, we'll remind him. Tomorrow we build a signal fire. He smiled, small and tired. Before dawn he was gone. All he left behind was a stick he'd carved into the shape of a cross. I still have it. Have you ever met someone for just one night and they stayed with you forever? It's strange how the smallest kindness can echo louder than years of pain. By the time I reached the outskirts of Phoenix, the dust storms had started. They rolled across the horizon like great brown oceans, swallowing light, erasing everything. I wrapped a wet rag around my face and kept walking. When the storm passed, I found the land transformed. Fences buried, houses half swallowed, trees stripped bare. But there were signs of life too. Men hammering wooden frames for new houses. Women handing out bread at church steps. Children chasing after trucks filled with lumber. The government called it reconstruction. To me, it looked like resurrection. That night, I slept in a camp near the Salt River. Fires burned in neat rows, like stars fallen to earth. Men told stories about where they'd come from, Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, all looking for the same thing, a reason to stay alive. When my turn came, I said I was a carpenter from Chicago. A man across the fire grinned and said, "Then you're in luck, friend. Roosevelt's hiring builders to save the world." I laughed, though part of me wanted to cry. Save the world. The phrase sounded too big for men who didn't even own boots without holes. Still, when morning came, I followed him into town. There was a line outside a government office, a banner flapping overhead. Works Progress Administration, Building America. The clerk didn't ask about my past or my grief, just my hands. I showed him my calloused palms and he nodded. "You'll fit right in." That night, for the first time in months, I slept under a roof. It wasn't home, but it was shelter. The walls creaked, the air smelled of sawdust and sweat, and somehow that felt like hope. I dreamed of the boy again, standing in the dust, holding his carved cross to the sky. Maybe he was right to ask if God still remembered this place. Maybe the answer was yes, just not in words, but in the sound of hammers, the rhythm of rebuilding. Because sometimes, the only prayer the world understands is the sound of someone refusing to give up. Tell me, if you'd been there walking those dusty miles beside me, would you have believed that broken hands could build something holy again? They say the desert doesn't forgive, but sometimes it forgets, and in that forgetfulness, mercy blooms. It happened on my 3rd week working under the sun. My hands had already learned the rhythm again. Lift, strike, smooth, repeat. The sound of hammers echoed across the half-built schoolhouse like a heartbeat for the town. Sweat ran down my back, dust stung my eyes, and yet I felt more alive than I had in years. But that day the heat rose early. By noon, one of the men fainted beside the scaffolding. His name was Joe, a farmer from Kansas who'd lost his land to the wind. We laid him in the shade, but the shade was as hot as the sun. When work ended, I walked toward the edge of town, where the road turned to dry creek bed. I was thirsty, the kind of thirst that makes your throat feel like it's lined with glass. My canteen had been empty since morning. That's when I saw a small farmhouse, half hidden behind a line of brittle mesquite trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, a rare sight in summer. I knocked on the door, more out of hope than manners. A woman opened it. She was thin, with eyes the color of clay after rain. A child clung to her skirt. Behind her, the house was tidy but bare. A table, 2 chairs, a stove older than either of us. "You're with the builders?" she said, not asked. I nodded. "Just passing through. I was hoping." "Water?" she finished as if she'd already known. She led me around back, where a well sat under a wooden frame. I drew the bucket myself. The water was warm, tasted of earth, and still it felt like grace. I drank until my body stopped shaking. When I thanked her, she smiled, a small, tired curve of the lips that looked like it hadn't been used in months. "Work must be hard," she said. "It's honest," I replied. "That's more than I had before." She nodded, then asked, "Would you mind taking a look at my fence?" My husband left last year to find work in Tucson. Never came back. There was no bitterness in her voice. Just the flat tone of someone who'd accepted too many disappearances. The fence was broken in 3 places. I fixed it with what scrapwood I could find, using my old habit of humming while I worked, a song my wife used to love. When I finished, the little boy brought me a biscuit, hard as a stone but made with pride. I ate it slowly, like communion. Before I left, the woman handed me a small jar of beans. "For the road," she said. I wanted to refuse. She clearly had little, but her eyes told me this was not charity. It was dignity. The giving made her feel human again. As I walked back to camp, I thought about that fence. How something so small, a few planks and nails, could mean safety, order, a sense that the world could still hold together. Maybe that's what kindness really is. Not grand gestures, not miracles. Just a few repaired boards that keep the wind from swallowing everything. That night, the men sat around the fire trading stories. Someone joked about how the desert had more snakes than jobs. Another played a broken harmonica. I passed around the jar of beans. Nobody asked where it came from. We just ate quietly, gratefully. When the stars rose, I lay back and stared at them, wondering about the woman and her boy. Were they sitting by their own small fire, watching the same sky? The desert stretched between us like an ocean, but I felt connected. By wood, by hunger, by the shared act of holding on. Have you ever felt that, the strange warmth that comes from helping a stranger, or being helped when you least deserve it? It doesn't make the world easier, but it makes it gentler for a moment. I still remember her parting words. "Tell the others," she said, "that we're still here, that this land hasn't beaten us yet." The next morning, I carried her message to the work site. When the men grew tired, I told them about her, the nameless woman by the creek who kept hope alive with biscuits and broken fences. They laughed, but softer than usual. And that day, no one complained about the heat. Sometimes, it takes a single act of kindness to remind an entire crew of men that we're not just rebuilding walls, we're rebuilding the world we want to believe in. And as I lay down that night, I whispered to the dust, "She's still here. We all are. Tell me, if you'd been in her place, would you have given your last biscuit to a stranger? Or would you have kept it, afraid tomorrow might never come?" There's a sound you never forget. The low, trembling whistle of a freight train cutting through the desert night. It carries a sadness that isn't quite sorrow, and a hope that isn't quite belief. That night, I sat by the tracks outside Phoenix, the city's lights faint behind me, and the dark ahead stretching forever south. I wasn't planning to ride, not yet. But I liked being close to the sound of motion, of something still moving in a country that had nearly stopped breathing. The sky was clear. The stars looked sharper here, as if the desert had sanded the heavens clean. I lay back on the dirt, feeling the earth's slow heartbeat under my spine, and listened. Somewhere, far away, someone else was hearing the same whistle and thinking of home. Work on the schoolhouse had finished the week before. Our crew was waiting for new assignments, bridges, maybe, or irrigation ditches, but government money had slowed again. Each morning, we checked the board at the WPA office. Each afternoon, another day of waiting. It's strange how quickly people can adapt to uncertainty. You start counting not in days but in meals. one for breakfast, one for hope, one for tomorrow if luck holds. That evening, Mr. Sullivan, the foreman, stopped by our boarding house. "They're cutting half the crew," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Nothing personal. Just less work to go around." Half the men stared at the floor. The other half stared at the future as if they could see it closing like a door. When my name wasn't on the list, I felt relief, then guilt. Luck feels like theft when you watch good men lose what little they have left. After supper, I walked to the tracks. Some habits don't need reasons. I carried the small wooden cross the boy had carved, the one I kept from my journey west. It had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that even lost souls can build something with their hands. That's where I met them, a father and daughter waiting by the train. The man was tall and gaunt, the kind of thin that isn't just hunger but years of missing meals. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, clutching a burlap sack like it held the whole world. "You headed somewhere?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "South. Heard there's work near Tucson. Cotton fields, maybe." "Hard work," I said. "Better than no work." The train whistle echoed closer. They both stood as if the sound itself pulled them upright. When the train roared past, a line of open freight cars flashed by like a stuttering film reel. Faces, hands, shadows. The man lifted his daughter up, one hand under her arm, and waited for the right moment. He turned to me. "You got anyone waiting for you?" "No," I said. "Not anymore." "Then you'll understand." He climbed aboard first, then reached down. The girl hesitated, her eyes wide, not with fear but awe, the kind of wonder only a child could still carry in a time like this. The moment stretched. The sound, the dust, the light, all of it fused into one long breath. Then the train was gone, carrying them south into the dark. I stood there for a long while after, staring down the empty tracks. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a father was promising his daughter a better tomorrow. I didn't know if he could keep that promise, but I envied him the courage it took to make it. Back at the boarding house, I couldn't sleep. The desert wind slipped through the cracks in the wall, whispering like a voice I almost recognized. It carried the same question I'd been asking since the day I left Chicago. What keeps us moving? Hunger, hope, or habit? I thought about Mary, my wife. How she believed in my hands long after I'd stopped believing in them myself. How she used to say, "You can't stay lost forever, Sam. Sooner or later, something will find you." Maybe she was right. Maybe the something wasn't work or money, but meaning. At dawn, I walked back to the tracks. The rails were still warm from the night before. A tumbleweed rolled past, chasing its own shadow. I placed the boy's cross between the wooden ties, pressed into the earth, facing south. Prayer maybe, or a promise. The next train came just as the sun rose, gold light spilling across the steel like forgiveness. I didn't climb aboard. Not yet. But for the first time, I didn't feel stuck. Just waiting for the right moment. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't moving on. It's learning to stay still long enough to listen. To the wind, to the rails, to your own heartbeat. Until it tells you where to go. Tell me, if you were standing there on that empty track, would you have jumped on the train? Or would you have waited, like me, for a sign that the road you're on still leads somewhere worth reaching? The Salt River only runs part of the year. Most days it's a dry scar across the desert, pale sand and broken stone, shimmering under the weight of the sun. But when the rains come, even a little, it remembers what it used to be. That spring the water returned. Not much, just enough to move, to glint under the morning light. I walked there after work, boots full of dust, shirt clinging with sweat. I wanted quiet, the kind that doesn't feel like loneliness. The air smelled of wet earth, rare perfume for this land. Cicadas buzzed like they were grateful simply to exist. I sat on a fallen log and watched the current, slow, deliberate, like a man relearning how to breathe. That's where I met Sophie. She was sketching the river, her pencil dancing across a page as if she were afraid it might disappear again before she finished. She wore a straw hat too big for her face and had dirt on her hands, which somehow made her look more alive. "You're one of the builders," she said without looking up. "Guess the hammer gave me away." "More like the way you stare at things," she replied. "People who build can't help measuring the world." I smiled. "And what do you do?" "Teach," she said. "Or try to. Adults mostly. Reading, writing, a little hope." "Hope's the hardest subject," I said. She looked up then, eyes reflecting the water's movement. "That's why I start with words. People forget words are how we remember we're human. We talked until sunset. About work, about Roosevelt's programs, about the dust storms still haunting the plains. She told me how her students, men twice her age, struggled to hold pencils steady after years of holding shovels instead. They think they're too old to learn, she said softly, but I tell them the dust hasn't settled yet. That night, I lay awake in my rented room thinking about her voice. It had the calm of someone who'd seen loss but refused to bow to it. I wondered what it would be like to live like that, not fighting the storm, just walking through it with quiet defiance. The next evening, I found myself back at the river. She was there again, sketching in the same spot. She smiled when she saw me. I thought you'd be halfway to California by now. Not yet, I said. Still got a few things left to fix here. We sat together in silence for a while. When the wind passed through the cottonwoods, it sounded like whispers, like the river itself was speaking. Sophie said, "My mother used to tell me rivers carry voices, that if you listen long enough, you can hear the people who came before." Ever hear anything? I asked. She nodded toward the water. Sometimes, not words, just forgiveness. The light began to fade. The sky turned copper, then purple. She handed me her sketchbook. On the page was the river, rough lines, uncertain edges, but alive. "It's not perfect," she said. "It doesn't have to be," I told her. "Neither do we." When she left, I stayed behind. The water caught the moonlight now, tracing silver paths through the sand. I closed my eyes and listened. The wind shifted, and for a moment, I swore I heard voices, faint but familiar. My father's laughter. My mother humming. Mary calling my name from a time before the crash. Maybe it was memory. Maybe the river really does remember for us when we forget. Have you ever stood somewhere so still that the past felt close enough to touch? As if all your mistakes and all your loves were flowing right beside you, waiting to be forgiven? When I finally rose to leave, I took one last look at the river, not as a wound, but as a promise. Tomorrow, I decided I'd help Sophie with her classes after work. If she was teaching men to read again, maybe I could remind them how to build again. The world had taken much from us, jobs, homes, certainty, but maybe we could trade something back. Skill for story, muscle for meaning. As I walked home under the starlight, I realized the dust didn't own us anymore. We were learning to speak again, through hands, through words, through kindness. And somewhere in that gentle flow of water and night, I heard it again. "Keep building," the river whispered. "You're almost whole." Tell me, if you'd been there beside that river, would you have believed it was only water you heard? Or would you have listened long enough to catch the voices too? It started with a smell, sharp, dry, almost sweet. The kind of scent that makes your throat tighten before you understand why. We'd been working on the bridge outside Phoenix that week, laying steel under a sky so bright it hurt to look at. I remember wiping sweat from my neck when I saw the smoke, a thin gray thread curling up beyond the cottonwoods. At first, I thought it was someone burning trash or cooking supper too long. But the wind shifted and the gray turned orange. By sundown, the horizon was on fire. The others climbed onto the truck, eager to see. "Could be the feed mill," one of the men said. "Maybe that old lumber yard." Whatever it was, the flames didn't care who they belonged to. When we reached the edge of town, I saw the truth. A row of shacks along the riverbank, the kind where migrant families lived, gone up like kindling. The wind carried sparks across the sand, scattering them like cursed stars. People ran with buckets, wet blankets, anything that might matter. I ran too. Some things you don't think about, your body just decides before your mind catches up. The heat was unbearable. Smoke clawed into my eyes. I saw a woman trying to drag a mattress from her burning porch. I pulled her back, coughing, shouting, but she kept screaming, "My baby's inside." I didn't think. I went in. The world turned into noise and light. Wood cracking. Tin collapsing. My lungs filled with fire. But there, under the smoke, was a cry, thin, desperate, alive. I found the child under a table, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide with terror. I grabbed him and ran, feeling the floor give way beneath us just as we reached the door. When we stumbled into the night, the crowd opened, gasping. Someone took the baby from my arms. I dropped to my knees, coughing up black dust that tasted like the end of the world. The woman fell beside me, holding her child, sobbing so hard she forgot to thank me. She didn't need to. Some things don't require words. By morning, half the camp was gone. Charred ground where lives had stood. The Red Cross arrived, setting up tents. Sophie came too, her hair pulled back, her dress stained with ash from helping carry supplies. When she saw me, she froze. "Sam, your hands." I looked down. The skin was blistered raw. I hadn't even noticed. "They'll heal," I said, though I wasn't sure. She shook her head, eyes glistening. "You're supposed to build things, not burn with them." That night I couldn't sleep. The sky was heavy with smoke, the stars hidden. From my window, I watched volunteers hand out food, blankets, clothes. The people who had nothing were giving what little they had left. It was a kind of miracle, quiet, unsentimental, but wholly all the same. In the distance, the last embers glowed like a dying heart. And I wondered, how many times can a person start over before the world forgets who they used to be? The next day, Sophie found me by the river. She brought a small bowl of salve for my hands, made from aloe and something that smelled like honey. As she wrapped the bandages, she said softly, "They'll scar." "Maybe that's good," I said. "Scars remind us where we've been." She smiled faintly. "Then I guess the world is covered in them." We sat in silence, watching smoke drift across the water. A child's laughter rose from the tents, the same boy I'd carried out of the fire. His mother waved to me. I waved back. And for a moment I felt something strange, not pride, not relief, but belonging. Like I wasn't just passing through anymore. Like maybe this broken place had claimed me too. The fire had taken everything fragile and left only what could endure. People, hands, courage. That was enough. Have you ever stood before ruins and realized you were still alive, not by luck, but by choice? It's a strange kind of strength, the quiet decision to keep caring when the world keeps burning. That night, I returned to the half-built bridge. The steel glowed faintly in the moonlight, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. I laid my bandaged hands against the cold metal and whispered, "We'll finish this." And in the stillness, the wind carried a sound, faint but certain, like hammers far away building something new from ash. Tell me, if you'd been there, would you have run into that burning house? Or would you have stayed outside, praying the fire would show mercy? A week after the fire, a letter arrived. It was a rare thing in those days, paper with your name on it, written by a hand that still remembered you. I found it tucked beneath my door when I came home from the job site. The envelope was thin, edges worn. The postmark said Chicago. For a long while, I just held it. Funny how a piece of paper can weigh more than any beam or stone. When I finally opened it, the words blurred before I could read them. My mother's handwriting. Still careful, still steady, like she was trying to hold the world together with ink. "We are managing, Sam. Your father works some days with the WPA along the lakefront, planting trees. He says it feels strange to build something new at his age. I think he likes it, though he won't admit it. Mrs. Petrovic reopened her bakery. She named it after her husband. You remember her, don't you? The one who used to send you home with extra bread. She said to tell you, we're still here." I stopped reading for a while after that. The words "we're still here" hit harder than I expected. For so long, I'd imagined Chicago frozen in the moment I left it. Streets empty, factories silent, everyone swallowed by the same despair that drove me west. But now, through that fragile letter, the city exhaled again. It was still alive, and so was I. The letter went on. "There's talk things might finally be turning. Your cousin Frank found steady work. The city feels different now, slower, maybe kinder. People talk more. They share. Maybe the worst is behind us. Right when you can, son. We still keep your place at the table." When I reached the last line, I realized my hands were shaking. There it was again, that word I'd forgotten the taste of: home. That night, I sat by the river with Sophie and read the letter aloud. She listened quietly, eyes soft, as if the words were her own. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. I looked out at the dark water. "Every day. But I don't know what I'd be going back to. The man who left that city isn't the same one reading this letter." She nodded. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe home isn't where you started. Maybe it's the place that lets you forgive who you used to be." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, I dreamed of Chicago, the smell of coal smoke, the hum of streetcars, the laughter from the tenement windows on summer nights. But the dream shifted. The buildings were still there, but the streets were full of faces I didn't know. New people rebuilding, surviving just as we were in Phoenix. When I woke, the sky was just turning gray. I sat by the window and listened to the first train whistle of morning. The letter lay open on the table beside me. The ink shimmered faintly in the half-light, like something alive. I took out a pencil and began to write a reply. It had been years since I'd tried to fit my life into words. How do you explain to your parents that you've changed in ways you can't name? That the dust and heat have carved you into something both smaller and stronger? I started simply. Dear Ma and Pa, I'm still here too. The rest came slow. Stories of the bridge, of the fire, of Sophie's students learning to read by lantern light. I told them about the boy I'd pulled from the burning house, about how he'd learned to laugh again within a week. I told them about the kindnesses I'd seen, small, fleeting, but enough to keep faith alive. When I finished, I didn't seal the letter. I just sat with it the way you sit with a prayer before you say amen. Later that day at the WPA office, I asked Mr. Sullivan if any crews were heading north. He raised an eyebrow. Thinking of leaving us, Sam? Just thinking of visiting, I said. Maybe not yet, but someday. He nodded. When you do, you'll have stories worth telling. That evening, Sophie and I walked along the Salt River again. The water was low, whispering more than flowing. I told her about my letter. She smiled. You should keep writing. To them, to yourself, to whoever's listening. I asked, you think anyone really listens anymore? She looked up at the fading sky. Always. The world may not answer, but it remembers. As the sun sank behind the mountains, I felt something shift inside me. Not quite peace, but direction. The kind you can walk toward even if it's far away. Maybe the depression had taken the old world from us. But maybe, through letters and stories, we were building a new one, quieter, humbler, more connected. Tell me, if you got a letter from the life you left behind, would you open it right away? Or would you wait until you were brave enough to remember who you used to be? The letter changed something in me. It was as if the words themselves had opened a window inside my chest, letting in a breeze I hadn't felt in years. 4 days afterward, I caught myself looking east when the sun rose, wondering what the morning looked like in Chicago. The city I'd left behind was still there, older, quieter maybe, but alive. And part of me ached to see it again. Not the buildings, not even the streets, but the people who'd once filled them with noise and laughter and arguments that only families can have. At the bridge site, I worked slower than usual. My thoughts wandered north while my hands kept moving on their own. The men noticed. You got ghosts back home, Sam? One of them joked. Maybe, I said. Or maybe they've been waiting for me to stop running. That evening, I walked to the train depot. Not to buy a ticket, just to listen. The platforms smelled of oil and dust, and the trains hissed like sleeping beasts. Families waited with suitcases tied in rope. A mother brushed her son's hair with her hand, whispering something I couldn't hear. The board listed destinations like promises: Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago. Each name felt like a memory calling me back. I thought of Sophie then, her students, her river sketches, her steady eyes. I told myself she was just a friend, but it was more than that. She was the sound of peace in a world that hadn't known quiet for years. When I told her about my plan to visit home, she didn't say much at first. She just nodded, the way people do when they understand before you finish speaking. How long will you go? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer. And if you find what you've been missing? I smiled faintly. Then I'll know what to bring back. She didn't try to stop me. That was the thing about Sophie, she never held on too tightly. Maybe she knew that love, like the river, only keeps flowing when it's given room to move. The night before I left, the desert wind picked up. The sky turned the color of brass, the air full of static and whispering dust. I packed a small bag, just enough clothes, a photograph of my parents, and the little wooden cross from the boy I'd met long ago. It felt right to carry reminders of both beginnings and endings. At dawn, Sophie walked me to the station. You'll write, she said. Every week, I promised. She handed me a small envelope. Don't open it until you're halfway there. The train whistle cut through the quiet morning and I climbed aboard. The carriage smelled of coal and coffee. Outside, the desert stretched wide and endless. A place I'd once called exile, now feeling strangely like home. As the train began to move, I watched Sophie shrink into the distance until she was just a blur of color against the sand. For a long while, I couldn't look away. Hours passed. Towns flickered by: Mesa, Florence, Tucson. The land changed slowly from red dust to greener fields. Children waved from crossings. Men tipped their hats. And for the first time in years, I felt something soft and unfamiliar settle inside me. Belonging. Halfway to New Mexico, I remembered her envelope. I tore it open carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with a single line written in her careful hand. "Don't go looking for the man you used to be. He stayed here and he's safe." I read it 3 times before setting it on my lap. Outside the window, the sun dipped low, painting the rails in gold. I rested my forehead against the glass and whispered, "Thank you." The journey north took 3 days. Each night, I dreamed of the same thing. The river in Phoenix, moonlight rippling across its surface, whispering, "Keep building." Maybe that was all home really meant. Not a place you return to, but the people who keep you steady while you rebuild. When the conductor called, "Chicago next," my hands trembled. I stared at the skyline rising through the morning fog, familiar yet changed. And I realized something simple but true. You can't ever really go back. But sometimes you can bring the best parts of where you've been and let them meet the parts of you that never stopped hoping. Tell me, if you had a chance to return to the place you left behind, would you take it? Or would you stay where the scars have already begun to heal? The train rolled into Chicago at dawn, its wheels clattering like a heartbeat I hadn't heard in years. The air smelled the same, smoke, iron, rain waiting somewhere behind the clouds. But the city itself, it felt quieter. Not dead, just older, slower, like someone who'd been sick too long and was learning to walk again. I stepped off the platform and stood still for a moment, letting the sound of it all wash over me. The station echoed with voices, but they didn't feel familiar. I realized how much time had passed, how long I'd been gone. When I left, the depression had just begun to swallow everything. I remembered the bread lines that wrapped around corners, the men selling apples for pennies, the way silence would fall over whole blocks when a factory whistle blew. Another closing, another round of pink slips. Now, as I walked through the streets, I saw life again. Shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks. Children in second-hand coats chasing after streetcars. Workers hauling lumber to construction sites. The city was rebuilding itself, piece by piece, as if refusing to stay buried. Still, there were scars. Burned-out windows. Empty lots where tenements once stood. Posters for Roosevelt peeling from brick walls, the paper curling like the memory of old promises. I walked until my feet remembered where to go. Down Halsted, across Madison, past the church where I used to sit in the back pew on cold Sundays, pretending I was praying when really I was just trying to stay warm. And then, my street. The building was still there, though the paint had faded and the stairs sagged like tired bones. I stood at the foot of it, heart thudding harder than it had in years. When I knocked, it was my father who opened the door. For a second, he didn't recognize me. Then his face changed, not shock, not even surprise, just quiet understanding, as if he'd always known this moment would come. "Sam," he said simply. No anger, no questions, just my name. It was all I needed to hear. Inside, the apartment looked smaller, the walls closer, but the smell, coffee, wood polish, something baking, was the same. My mother came from the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour. She froze when she saw me, then crossed the room in 2 steps and held me like she was afraid I'd vanish again. No one said much for a while. Words felt unnecessary. We just sat at the table, letting the silence fill in what years had taken away. Later, my father poured coffee, black and strong. "We got by," he said, as if explaining everything at once. Word came back, slowly. "Your ma started sewing for the neighbors again. Frank got on with the parks department. You remember Frank?" I nodded. "I heard. WP, right?" He smiled faintly. "You heard right." We talked until the sun dipped behind the rooftops. It was strange. Every story they told sounded both foreign and familiar, like hearing about a dream you once had but forgot. When they went to bed, I sat by the window, looking out at the streetlights flickering to life. A light rain had started to fall, washing the dust off the city's tired skin. That's when I noticed the bakery across the street, the one Mrs. Petrovic had reopened. The sign above the door read Petrovic's bread. The smell drifted through the rain, yeast and butter, the scent of survival. I crossed the street and peered through the glass. Inside, the shelves were half empty. A woman, older now, thinner, was wiping the counter. She looked up, squinted, then smiled. "Samuel," she said, "you came back." I hadn't realized she'd remember me. She handed me a roll, still warm. "No charge," she whispered. "For old times." When I stepped back outside, the rain had stopped. Steam rose from the bread in my hand, curling into the cool air. I took a bite. It tasted like memory, a little sweet, a little sad. I walked home slowly, the city glowing in puddles at my feet. And for the first time since leaving, I didn't feel like a stranger. Still, I couldn't shake one thought. Everything here had changed. So had I. The question was whether we could recognize each other after all that loss. Have you ever gone back to a place you once loved and found that it still loved you back even after all your mistakes? That night, I lay in my childhood bed, listening to the rain tap against the window. I thought of the desert, of Sophie by the river, of the sound of hammers echoing under the sun. Home, I realized, wasn't one place anymore. It was both the dust and the rain, the silence and the song. And somewhere between them, I had finally begun to belong. A few days after coming home, I ran into Paul. He'd lived in the same neighborhood all his life, the kind of man who plants his feet deep and lets the storm pass over him. I found him in front of the old machine shop, the one that used to roar with noise before the crash silenced it. Now it was open again, humming softly, like a heart that had finally remembered its rhythm. He was older, of course. We both were. But his shoulders were still broad, his eyes still sharp. When he saw me, he didn't say anything right away, just laughed, that same deep laugh that used to fill the room back when we were young and stupid enough to believe nothing could break us. "Sam," he said finally, shaking his head, "I'll be damned. Thought the desert swallowed you." "Almost did," I said, "but it spit me back out." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Good. You always were too stubborn to die." We walked down Madison together, past storefronts half repaired, half waiting. I asked how he'd managed all these years. He shrugged. "You stay. You work what you can. You make peace with losing more than you win. It's not noble, Sam. It's just what's left." His words weren't bitter, just honest. Paul had seen everything I'd run from. The layoffs, the soup lines, the winters when the pipes froze and the city's heart froze with them. He stayed when men like me drifted west in search of anything that felt like control. "You ever regret not leaving?" I asked. He took a long drag from his cigarette, then smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but someone had to hold the line. Keep the lights on. Make sure there was still a city for you wanderers to come back to." I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe he was right. Maybe survival takes different shapes. Some of us rebuild elsewhere, some guard what's left behind. We ended up at a bar that hadn't changed since before the crash. Same cracked mirror behind the counter, same bartender polishing the same glass. Time had paused here, too tired to move on. Paul raised his glass. "To the ones who left," he said. I lifted mine. "And the ones who stayed." The beer was warm and flat, but it tasted like forgiveness. He told me stories about men we'd worked with, now gone or married or changed beyond recognition. About how the government jobs had brought the city back, one brick and paycheck at a time. How the unions fought, bled, and sometimes even won. "You'd be proud," he said. The men here, they stopped bowing, started talking back. We had to learn that hunger can't be tamed with silence. I listened, feeling something like pride. The same fight that had built bridges in Arizona was alive here too, just in different hands. As the night wore on, the bar grew louder, laughter, arguments, the clinking of glass. But beneath it all was a hum of life I hadn't heard in years. Chicago wasn't healed, not yet, but it was breathing again. When we stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining like rivers of glass. Street lamps flickered in the puddles, each one a trembling reflection of something trying to return. Paul lit another cigarette and handed me one. I didn't smoke anymore, but I took it anyway, out of habit, out of memory. "You'll stay a while?" he asked. "Maybe a week, maybe more." He nodded. "Don't rush. The city's got time now." We stood there in the quiet, watching the steam rise from the manholes, listening to the faraway whistle of a freight train rolling west. It sounded different now, not a call to escape, but a reminder of distance, of how far I'd come and how much I'd brought back with me. Before we parted, Paul said something I've never forgotten. "You know, Sam, it wasn't the work that saved us. It was the waiting. We waited for each other. And when the waiting ended, we were still here." That night, lying in my childhood bed, I thought about those words. How many times had I mistaken motion for progress? Maybe the real strength was in staying put, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Because it meant refusing to let despair claim the ground beneath your feet. Have you ever wondered which kind of survivor you are? The one who leaves or the one who stays? I don't think one is better than the other. Maybe we need both. The wanderers to bring back new ways of hope, and the stayers to keep the fire burning until we return. Chicago was never a quiet city. Not in my childhood, not in the years before the crash. It used to roar, with trains, with factory whistles, with the shouting of men who believed noise was proof they were alive. Now, walking those same streets years later, the quiet startled me more than the chaos ever had. The factories still stood, but they hummed softer now. The air was cleaner, somehow gentler, like the city had learned to breathe between its own heartbeats. Windows glowed with lamplight. Cafes that had gone dark were open again, not crowded, but steady. I passed a movie theater where a poster for Modern Times hung crooked. Charlie Chaplin smiled from behind glass scratched by wind and years. A handful of people waited in line, collars turned up against the chill. Laughter drifted from inside as the film began. Real laughter, the kind that surprises you by existing at all after so much loss. Stopped me cold. Because laughter, in a city that once forgot how to eat, feels like a resurrection. I walked past a park where children were skating on a frozen pond. Their shouts echoed through the air, wild, unguarded joy. I thought of the Hoovervilles that once stood there, the shanties built from tin and cloth and pride. Gone now. Grass had returned. Trees were planted. Life was reclaiming the ruins. It's strange how survival isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or parades. It just endures, quietly. Every corner held a ghost. The barber who used to hum as he cut hair was gone. His shop turned into a tailor's. The grocery where Mary and I once bought bread now sold radios. The church bells still rang, but slower, like they'd aged too. I found myself on LaSalle Street at dusk. The sky burned orange behind the tall buildings, their windows catching fire in the light. I stopped in front of a boarded-up storefront, the old office where I'd once dreamed of a career, a future, a name printed on glass. The glass was gone now, so were those dreams. But I didn't feel sad. I just felt still. It occurred to me then, maybe the city hadn't changed as much as I had. Maybe it was me who'd grown quiet. Me who'd stopped mistaking ambition for purpose. I sat on a bench near the river. The water was dark, carrying reflections of the bridge lights like slow-moving stars. Two men stood nearby, smoking, talking about union wages, about Roosevelt, about another war brewing overseas. Their voices were low but steady, the sound of people who'd learned to trust again at least a little. And I realized something. This city, this battered, soot-streaked, stubborn place, it wasn't just surviving. It was forgiving itself. We all were. That night, I walked home through the neighborhood where I grew up. The bakery lights were off now. The smell of yeast lingered in the cold air, faint but real. I passed windows glowing with the soft light of supper tables. Families gathered around what little they had, laughter mixing with the clinking of forks. For a moment, I stood outside one of those windows, unseen, and imagined I was part of it, not watching from the edge but sitting among them. The warmth spilling from those rooms wasn't just from the stoves. It was from the stubborn human refusal to stop loving life, even when life had given us every reason to let go. When I finally reached home, my mother was mending a coat by lamplight. "Out walking again?" she asked without looking up. "Just getting to know the city," I said. She smiled. "It'll let you. It always does if you're patient." Patience. That was a word we'd forgotten for a long time. We wanted quick recoveries, clean endings. But real healing, of cities, of hearts, is slow work. It doesn't shout. It whispers. As I climbed into bed, I thought of Phoenix. The desert, the dust, the river. Sophie sketching under the cottonwoods. The sound of hammers. And it struck me that every place has its own rhythm of recovery. The desert does it in silence. The city does it in hums. Both are beautiful. Both are holy. Have you ever gone back to a place you once knew and realized it was healing? Not fast, not perfectly, but honestly? If you have, you know that sound. It's not applause. It's not music. It's just the sound of people living again. And maybe that's the sweetest sound there is. Every morning, I woke to the same sound. Hammers, saws, the low hum of engines starting in the distance. Chicago had become a symphony of work again, though a quieter one than before. When I was younger, that sound meant ambition. It meant men chasing promotion, money, reputation. Now it meant survival, steady, patient, almost reverent. After breakfast, I started visiting job sites around the city. Not to work, not yet, just to watch. There was something almost holy about it. Men in worn coats, sleeves rolled up, faces smudged with soot and focus. Their movements weren't hurried anymore. Each nail, each brick, seemed to carry purpose beyond wages. At a site near the river, I stopped to speak with a crew repairing a bridge, not unlike the one I'd helped build in Phoenix. The foreman, a young man named Lewis, had a voice too old for his age. "WPA sent us here last spring," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We rebuilt 3 of these already. Folks cross them every day, never think twice. But that's all right. Bridges don't ask for thanks." I like that. Bridges don't ask for thanks. They just hold quietly so others can move forward. For hours I stood and listened to the rhythm, hammer, breath, silence, hammer again. It reminded me of prayer. Not the kind you whisper in church, but the kind you live through your hands. One man noticed me watching. "You looking for work?" he asked. "Not today," I said. "Just remembering how it feels." He nodded. "Feels better now. Before the crash, we built for other people. Now we build for each other." That stayed with me. Later that week, I visited the South Side, where the WPA had opened a new training center. Inside, I saw classrooms full of men and women learning trades: carpentry, plumbing, drafting. Chalk dust filled the air. Laughter too. That surprised me most. In one corner, a group of women practiced laying tile. Their hands were steady, their voices soft. A sign on the wall read, "We're not fixing the past. We're building what comes next." I stood there for a long while, reading those words over and over. Back in the Depression's worst years, I used to think of work as punishment, a cycle of exhaustion without reward. But watching them now, I saw something different: dignity. Work wasn't about money. It was about belonging. About knowing your effort added one more stitch to the torn fabric of the world. That evening, I walked to the lakefront where my father worked with the park crews. He was planting trees along the water, their roots wrapped in burlap, ready for soil. The air was sharp with cold. "Didn't expect to see you out here," he said, patting the dirt with his shovel. "I heard this is where the city breathes," I replied. He chuckled. "Not wrong. We plant 'em now, they'll give shade when we're long gone. Funny, isn't it? Doing work you'll never live to enjoy." I looked at him, his weathered hands, his quiet pride. "That's not funny, Pa. That's faith." We worked side by side for an hour, no words needed. Just the sound of roots meeting earth. Each tree we set upright felt like a promise kept. To those who'd lost everything, to those still rebuilding, to those not yet born. When the sun dipped low, the lake caught its reflection, turning gold and still. My father leaned on his shovel, breathing hard. "You know, Sam," he said, "back when it was bad, I thought work had betrayed us. Thought we'd never trust it again. But I was wrong. It wasn't the work that failed. It was the world around it. Now it's honest again." That night, lying in bed, I thought about his words. How easy it is to mistake struggle for failure and labor for punishment. But maybe work, real work, is the act of faith that keeps the world turning. I thought of Sophie and her students learning to write their names. Of the woman by the river who'd asked me to fix her fence. Of the men under the desert sun, sweating for a wage that barely fed them, yet never stopped building. The echo of hammers followed me into sleep. And I dreamed not of noise or exhaustion, but of rhythm, the heartbeat of a world mending itself. Tell me, when was the last time you looked at your own work and saw it for what it really is? Not just labor, not just duty, but a quiet kind of prayer. One that says, "I'm still here. I still believe in what we're building." The letter came in early spring. It had traveled far, the edges dust-stained, the ink faded by distance and weather. My name was written in a hand I knew by heart. Sophie. For a moment, I didn't open it. I just held it there on the kitchen table, the sunlight slipping across its surface like water. Some letters, you see, feel alive before you even read them. When I finally tore the seal, her voice seemed to rise right off the page. "Dear Sam, the river is almost gone again. You'd hardly recognize it, just a thin ribbon of light under the cottonwoods. But the students still come. They sit where the shade used to fall, reading out loud so the wind can hear. I tell them about you sometimes. I tell them that a man can rebuild the world one nail at a time, if he keeps believing in the work. I hope Chicago is kind to you. I hope you still listen when the wind speaks. Sophie." I read it twice, then a third time, slower. Her words felt like desert air, dry, simple, but filled with quiet life. Outside, Chicago was thawing. Snowmelt dripped from eaves, the streets slick with promise. The trees my father had planted months ago now bore the faintest green. I wanted to show her that, the small, almost invisible ways the city had healed itself. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket. That evening I walked down to the lake, the wind sharp but forgiving. I could almost hear her voice there, not in words but in rhythm. The waves lapped against the rocks with the same slow patience as the desert river. And I thought, maybe all water speaks the same language. Maybe all longing does too. It's strange how distance changes you. When I first met Sophie, I thought of her as part of a chapter I'd left behind. The heat, the dust, the endless horizon. But reading her letter, I realized she was the thread that tied every place I'd been. The reminder that kindness, like water, never really disappears. It just changes form. A few days later, I found myself in the post office with a blank envelope. I hadn't planned to write her back, but the pen moved on its own. Sophie, the city breathes again. The factories hum like old songs, and my father plants trees that will outlive us both. The noise is softer now, not desperate, just steady. I work again here and there, fixing what time forgot. Sometimes I walk by the river and imagine you there, sketching, listening. The water here speaks slower, but it still speaks. Thank you for reminding me that even the quietest work matters. Sam. I sealed it and left it on the counter overnight, unsure if I'd send it. Some words, like prayers, don't need to travel far to be heard. That night, I dreamed of the desert, not harsh and endless as before, but gentle, softened by moonlight. Sophie stood by the river, her sketchbook open, the water glowing faintly beneath her hand. When she looked up, she smiled and said, "It's enough." When I woke, the morning light had the same softness as that dream. I took the letter and mailed it before I could change my mind. Days passed. Work resumed. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air again, that steady rhythm that had followed me from state to state. But inside me, something lighter had begun to grow. Not excitement, not yearning exactly, but peace. You know that feeling when someone far away is thinking of you at the same moment you think of them? That quiet connection, invisible but strong as steel? That's what her letter left behind. Weeks later, I returned to the river on the south side, where the new bridge stretched across the water like an open hand. I stood in the middle and listened. The current moved slow, deliberate, whispering against the stone. I closed my eyes and imagined her there beside me, the wind in her hair, her pencil tracing the light. And for the first time, the distance didn't feel like loss. It felt like belonging spread wide. Because sometimes the people who change us most aren't the ones who stay. They're the ones who teach us how to keep walking without fear. Tell me, have you ever received a letter that didn't just speak to you, but listened to you? The kind that arrived not to reopen old wounds, but to remind you that you were never really alone? If you have, then you know. Some words travel farther than miles. It was my father's idea. He said the city needed more trees, not because they were beautiful, but because they reminded people to look up. We've spent too many years looking down, he told me, his hands deep in the soil. At debts, at dirt, at our own feet. It's time we raised our eyes again. So on a gray morning that promised rain, we went to the park by the lake. The ground was still cold from winter, but soft enough to turn. He brought 2 saplings wrapped in burlap and string. "You take that one," he said, pointing to the taller of the 2. "Let's see if you still remember how to dig straight." I smiled. I remember. We worked in silence. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves. Around us, the city stirred, car horns, laughter, the distant cry of a newsboy shouting headlines that would be forgotten by noon. But beneath all that, I could hear something steadier, the heartbeat of the ground, slow and patient. "Funny thing about planting trees," my father said after a while, "you never do it for yourself. You do it for people you'll never meet." He pressed his boot into the soil, firming it down. "Makes you humble." I looked at his hands, scarred, rough, steady. He'd spent his life building things for others. Benches, bridges, homes. Now, in his old age, he was still building, just in a different way. We didn't talk about my years away. Not directly. But every shovelful of earth we turned felt like forgiveness. Every root we tucked into the soil felt like a memory being made peace with. At one point, he stopped, leaning on his shovel, breathing heavy. "You ever miss the desert?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "But not the emptiness. The silence, maybe." He nodded. "There's good silence and bad silence. You found the good kind." When both trees were standing, we stepped back. They looked fragile, thin, barely taller than I was when I first left home. The wind caught their branches, bending them until I thought they might break. But they didn't. They just swayed, resilient, learning how to live with motion. "Give it a few years," my father said, brushing dirt from his palms. "You'll come back and won't recognize them." I knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about the trees. We sat on a nearby bench to rest. The lake stretched wide and still before us, the horizon hazy where water met sky. I told him about Sophie, not everything, just enough. How she taught people to read, how she listened to rivers. He smiled. "Sounds like a woman who knows where she's going." "She does," I said softly, "even when the road disappears." He didn't ask more. My father was never one for questions that didn't need answers. After a while, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tin of tobacco, rolling a cigarette the old way by hand. He struck a match and watched the flame dance before it caught. "You know, Sam," he said, "we spend half our lives trying to build something worth leaving behind. The trick is learning it's not buildings or money. It's what keeps growing after you're gone." I looked at the saplings again, two small green promises trembling in the wind. "Maybe it's both," I said. "The things we build and the people who remember why." He smiled through the smoke. "That's my boy." We stayed until the rain began, light at first, then heavier. Drops spattered the dirt, darkening it. The new roots would drink well tonight. We didn't rush to leave. There was comfort in watching the sky open, in knowing the ground was ready to receive. Before we left, I carved something small into the wooden stake beside my tree. Not my name, just 2 words: "For tomorrow." Because that's what this was, a gift for a day I might never see, for hands I'd never shake, for someone who'd walk under that shade and not know who planted it. On the way home, my father said nothing. But when we reached the corner near our street, he stopped and looked at me. "You did good, Sam," he said quietly. "Better than you think." That night as I lay in bed, I could still smell the rain on my skin. I thought of the trees by the lake, drinking deeply, their roots threading through the dark earth, searching for the strength to hold. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without dreams. Tell me, have you ever planted something knowing you'd never see it grow? If you have, then you already understand what faith really is. It's not hope for yourself. It's hope for whoever comes next. It happened by accident. I was looking for a hammer. That's all. The drawer in my old workbench stuck as usual, and when it finally gave, a small envelope slipped out, yellowed, brittle at the edges. It fell open when it hit the floor. And there she was, Mary. Her face stared up at me from a photograph no larger than my palm. Her smile soft, uncertain, the kind people wear before they realize they're being photographed. The edges were creased, the surface scratched. I must have looked at that picture 1,000 times once. And then, for years, not at all. For a long while I just sat there on the workshop floor, the smell of oil and sawdust thick around me. The radio hummed quietly in the next room, a news broadcast I wasn't really hearing. Funny how a single image can reopen a whole world. The photograph wasn't just paper. It was time folded and kept too long. I remembered that day. We'd gone walking by the East River before everything fell apart. She'd insisted on bringing her little camera, the cheap box kind that caught too much light. She'd said, "Hold still, Sam. I want to remember you happy." And I'd laughed. "Then you'd better take it quick." When the shutter clicked, the wind caught her hair, and I remember thinking how ordinary the moment was, and how that was exactly why I loved it. We were both still young enough to believe that ordinary days would last forever. Now, decades later, holding that same picture, I realized how quietly time had moved. Not cruelly, just steadily, the way rivers carve their paths without meaning to. I wiped the dust from the photograph and set it on the table. The light from the window hit it at an angle that made her eyes almost alive again. And for the first time in years, I spoke to her. "I planted trees today," I said softly, "by the lake. You'd have liked it. The soil was good, dark, full of promise." The words surprised me. Maybe I hadn't been talking to the picture at all. Maybe I'd been talking to the silence that followed her all these years. Losing someone isn't like losing a job or a house or even a place. Those things leave space you can fill again. But a person leaves something deeper, a shape in the air that never quite closes. For years I carried that shape like a wound. I worked through it, ate through it, slept beside it. And slowly it became part of me, not pain exactly, but gravity. Something that kept me honest, kept me close to the ground. I slid the photo back into its envelope but didn't return it to the drawer. Instead, I placed it on the shelf by my bed. Not as an altar to what was lost, but as a reminder that love, even when gone, still builds things in you. It teaches you how to hold, how to let go, how to keep walking. Later that evening, my father stopped by, bringing leftover soup from the neighbor. He noticed the picture immediately. "Mary," he said quietly, "didn't think you still had that." "Neither did I replied. He sat down beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said something simple, something true. "Some folks think letting go means forgetting, but it doesn't. It just means you stop living inside the loss." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking at the photo on the nightstand, the faint smile, the wind in her hair, the sunlight she never saw again. And I realized something I hadn't before. I'd stopped being sad for her. Now I was grateful for the days we had, for the lessons she never meant to teach. In the morning, I opened the window. The air smelled of rain and lilac. I took the photo, kissed the corner gently, and tucked it into my jacket pocket before heading out. I wanted her to see the trees. When I reached the park, the saplings my father and I had planted stood straighter already, their leaves trembling in the morning breeze. I placed the photograph against one of the wooden stakes, just for a moment, letting the wind touch it. And I whispered, "You see?" We kept going. The photo fluttered slightly, then stilled. I took that as an answer. Tell me, have you ever found something from your past that didn't hurt anymore? Just reminded you of how far you've come? So, then you know what healing really feels like. It's not forgetting. It's remembering without breaking. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just another dramatization. The radio had been full of them lately, stories, speeches, the hum of faraway lives. But then the tone changed. The announcer's voice lost its rhythm, that steady broadcaster's calm, and began to tremble. "We interrupt this program to bring you a special bulletin. German forces have invaded Poland." I remember the silence that followed. Even the static seemed to hold its breath. I sat there at the table, the evening light fading through the kitchen window, my supper untouched. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as if nothing had changed. Children playing stickball, a dog barking down the streetcar's bell clanging faintly in the distance. But inside, something shifted. A familiar ache, one I'd felt years ago when banks closed and dreams collapsed. Only this time, it wasn't just about money. It was about the world itself, cracking open again. My father came in from the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "War?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed, that long, low exhale of a man who's already lived through too many beginnings and endings. We stood there listening. The announcer spoke of blitzkrieg, of bombings, of lines drawn and crossed. The map of Europe, so far from our quiet street, might as well have been our own hearts, small nations caught between forces too big to resist. It's strange, isn't it? How the world can end in one place while the sun still shines in another. How catastrophe can travel by sound, not distance. After a while, I turned the radio down, but not off. The faint murmur filled the room like a restless ghost. My father sat at the table, his head bowed. "You think it'll reach us?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "But everything reaches us eventually." He wasn't talking about war. Not exactly. He was talking about consequence. The way one world's collapse always ripples into another's. That night I went walking. The streets of Chicago glowed dimly under streetlights, puddles reflecting the soft orange hue. The air smelled of rain and iron. I passed the bakery, the barber shop, the small grocery where Mrs. Leon still swept the steps every night. Ordinary things. Beautiful, fragile, temporary. I thought of Sophie. Of her classroom in Arizona, the sound of her students reading English words under that open desert sky. Was she listening to the same news now? Did her hands tremble too as the voice on her radio spoke of borders and bombs? I found myself whispering to no one, "Not again, please not again." You'd think after surviving one collapse the world would learn. But maybe that's the cruelest part of being human. We remember pain, but we forget its lessons. When I got home, the radio was still on. The announcer now spoke of refugees, of trains filled with families fleeing toward nowhere in particular. My father had fallen asleep in his chair, his hat still on his head. The sound of his breathing blended with the static. I turned the volume down to a whisper and sat beside him. For a long time, I just listened to the hiss, the hum, the fragments of words from across the ocean. Warsaw, bombed again. Thousands displaced. Britain declares war. Each sentence landed like a small stone in a deep pond, spreading quiet ripples that reached me where I sat. I thought of the trees by the lake, the ones we planted months ago. They were growing in a world already burning somewhere else. Would they survive whatever came next? Would we? As the hours passed, the voice on the radio softened into evening programming, a piano song, melancholy and low, the kind that sounds like memory turned to music. I remember thinking then, maybe this is what the world always does. Build, collapse, rebuild. Bend, break, mend. And maybe people like us, the quiet ones, the carpenters, the teachers, are the thin line holding the pieces together while everyone else tears them apart. The song ended. The static returned. I switched the radio off. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. And in that silence, I whispered to the dark, I'll keep building. Not for nations, not for politics, for people, for tomorrow, for the promise that even after fire, something green can still rise. Tell me, have you ever heard news so big it made your own life feel small? And yet somehow that smallness felt sacred? That's how it was that night. Just me, a sleeping old man, and the weight of the world resting on a radio's breath. The first letter came wrapped in brown paper and sand. Literally, a faint sprinkling of desert dust still clung to the envelope when it arrived. The postmark read Phoenix, Arizona. The handwriting was unmistakable, rounded and steady, like someone who'd learned to write under a kerosene lamp. I held it for a long time before opening it. There was something sacred about Sophie's handwriting, something that made the air in the room feel still. Dear Sam, I've heard the news. Everyone has. The radio talks of nothing else now. But the desert is quiet. The storms have been kinder this year, and the new irrigation lines are holding. At night, I sit outside the schoolhouse and listen to the wind move across the sand. It sounds the same as always. Maybe that's a mercy, to have one corner of the world refuse to change. How is Chicago? Do you still walk by the lake? I like to think the water there remembers you. I smiled when I read that. She always had a way of turning simple words into something eternal. Her letters arrived irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes two in the same week. The mail was slow, uncertain, but it found me. It always did. She wrote about her students, about the cactus blooming early, about the men from the Works Progress Administration building a new library downtown. Sometimes she included a pressed flower, once even a small sketch, the outline of a tree growing alone in the desert, bending but unbroken. Each time I opened a letter, it was like the air changed in my little house. The smell of oil and smoke gave way to sage and dust. Chicago faded for a moment, replaced by that endless stretch of gold and silence. One evening, after reading her fifth letter, I found myself writing back without even realizing it. Sophie, the lake's still here. The water keeps its rhythm even when the world forgets how. My father and I planted trees last spring. They've grown stronger. I think of you every time the wind passes through their leaves. It sounds almost like your voice. The radio talks of war, but the world still builds. You taught me that. Thank you. I mailed it the next morning. 2 weeks later, her reply came. Sam, the students asked me today what hope means. I told them it's what people build when they have no reason to. You're proof of that. Keep building. That line stayed with me for days. Keep building. It sounded so simple, but it felt like a prayer. By autumn, her letters had become part of my weeks, like the sunrise or the smell of coffee in the morning. Each one carried a piece of calm that the world outside seemed to have lost. When Britain entered the war, Sophie wrote about how the students gathered in silence one evening, listening to the same broadcast through the crackle of her small radio. The youngest one asked if the stars looked different during war. She wrote, I told him no, the stars never take sides. There was something about that line that I couldn't shake. It reminded me how small we really are, and how precious that smallness can be. Sometimes I'd take her letters down to the lake and read them out loud under the open sky. People probably thought I was crazy talking to paper in the wind, but it helped. It made the distance feel smaller, like the desert could hear me if I spoke softly enough. Once, she ended a letter with a single sentence that changed everything. Sam, I hope one day you'll come back. The river misses your reflection. I didn't know what to make of it at first. A simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a world. Longing, forgiveness, invitation. I read that line over and over until the words blurred. Then I folded the letter, placed it in my coat pocket, and carried it with me every day after that. Not because I planned to leave, but because I needed to remember there was still a place that waited. The winter grew colder. The war louder. But in my pocket, I carried silence, her silence. The kind that heals, not hides. Tell me, have you ever received words that didn't demand an answer? Just made you breathe easier for a while? That's what her letters were like. Not promises, not goodbyes. Just reminders that even across the miles, someone still believed in something worth saving. The lights went out just after supper. No warning, no storm. Just silence, the kind that falls like a heavy blanket. For a moment, I thought it was just our block, but when I stepped outside, the whole neighborhood was dark. Even the lake, usually catching the city's glow, lay invisible under the sky. I stood there on the porch, breath turning white, listening. No hum of streetcars. No chatter from the tavern 2 doors down. Just wind moving between houses and the slow creak of frozen trees. Chicago had gone quiet before, during snowfalls, during strikes. But this was different. This felt hollow, like the city itself was holding its breath. Inside, my father struck a match and lit a single candle. Its small flame wavered but held. He set it on the table beside the radio. Power station must have tripped again, he muttered, though neither of us really believed it. I turned the dial, but all that came through was static. A low hiss that filled the room like distant rain. Funny thing about silence, it can make you hear things that aren't there. The tick of your own heartbeat. The echo of voices long gone. The sound of someone you once loved, whispering your name from across miles of desert. I could almost hear Sophie then. Not in words, just the shape of her voice, that steady warmth that could calm even the fiercest wind. The stars never take sides, she had written once. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Without the city's lights, the night sky looked raw, infinite. Stars, thousands of them, clear as breath on glass. And for the first time since I'd left Arizona, I saw the same constellations that must have been shining above her too. Maybe that's what she meant. Maybe this was how people stayed connected. Not through letters, not through wires, but through the quiet things that kept glowing when everything else went dark. The temperature dropped fast. I could see my breath in the candlelight. My father dozed off in his chair, his hands folded like he was praying. I wrapped a blanket around him, then sat by the window, the candle flickering beside me. From somewhere outside came the faint sound of footsteps crunching in snow. Someone called out, "You all right in there?" It was our neighbor, Mr. Wallace, making his rounds with a lantern. "All good," I called back. "You?" "Cold but standing," he said with a laugh. "Guess we'll earn our sleep tonight." The simple exchange felt like a lifeline, proof that even when everything stops, people still reach for one another. After he left, I found myself whispering again. "Sophie," I said quietly, "you'd like this silence." And I imagined her sitting by the window of that little desert schoolhouse, candlelight brushing her face, writing her next letter by hand. The thought warmed me more than the blanket did. Hours passed. The candle burned low, the wax pooling at its base like spilled gold. I thought about how fragile it was, this light, this life, this moment between peace and chaos. And yet, somehow it kept burning. That's the thing about fragility. It fools you into thinking it's weakness when really, it's endurance in disguise. Around midnight, I must have drifted to sleep. When I woke, dawn was breaking, gray and quiet. The lights hadn't returned, but I didn't mind. I made coffee on the wood stove, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stepped outside. The whole neighborhood looked softer, almost gentle. Smoke curled from chimneys, neighbors waved from porches. And for once, nobody was in a hurry. Sometimes it takes losing light to remember how to see. That night stayed with me for years. Not because of the blackout, but because of the calm it brought. For a few hours, the world had stopped running, and all that remained was breath and stars and silence. Have you ever lived through a blackout? The kind where the dark doesn't feel frightening, just honest? That's what it was like that night. The world paused, and for once, it didn't feel broken. It felt alive. For weeks, I checked the mailbox every morning. It became a ritual. Coffee in one hand, coat unbuttoned, I'd walk down to the corner and lift the creaking lid. Sometimes there'd be a newspaper, sometimes a bill, sometimes nothing at all. But not her handwriting. Not this time. The last letter from Sophie had arrived in late October. 3 pages written in her careful script, filled with talk of her students, the desert rains, and a line that stayed with me for days. If the world goes dark, remember, we are all lanterns to someone. I'd written her back the same night. Told her about the blackout, about the stars over Chicago, about how her words had become my compass. Then I waited. A week passed. Then 2. Then 6. No letter came. At first, I told myself it was the mail. War had changed everything. Routes disrupted, stations short-staffed. Maybe her letter was somewhere between here and nowhere, waiting to be found. But deep down, I felt the truth long before I accepted it. Sometimes silence isn't delay. It's finality wrapped in grace. One evening, I came home from work to find the mailbox empty again. The wind was sharp that day, dry enough to sting. I stood there longer than I should have, my fingers numb against the cold metal. And then, for the first time since the Depression, I felt small again. Not poor, not broken. Just human. Inside, my father was dozing in his chair, the radio murmuring faintly. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring at the stack of her letters tied neatly with a piece of twine. There were 17 of them in total. Each one a window into a life that seemed to grow further away. I opened the first and began to read. Slowly. Out loud. Her voice filled the room again. The way she described sunsets, her laughter between lines, her quiet faith that even dust could bloom. By the third letter, I stopped reading and just listened to the echoes. It felt like she was still there, sitting across from me. Maybe she always would be. Later that night, I took a walk down to the lake. The air bit hard, the water frozen near the shore. The city lights shimmered across the surface like distant stars caught in glass. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the last letter she sent. It was soft from being handled too often. The ink had smudged where my thumb always rested. We are all lanterns to someone. I whispered the words into the wind as if she might hear. The sound drifted across the lake and vanished. And in that vanishing, something shifted. I realized that maybe her silence wasn't absence. Maybe it was her way of telling me that I didn't need her letters anymore. That I'd already learned what they were meant to teach. Because love in its purest form doesn't always stay. Sometimes it leaves not as punishment but as permission to keep living, to keep building. I walked home slower that night, watching the streetlights glow through the fog. At every corner, I half expected to see her, leaning against a lamppost, smiling that quiet smile. Of course, she wasn't there. But I didn't feel lonely. Not exactly. Loneliness is when something's missing. What I felt was different. It was presence, stretched thin but still there, like music fading but never gone. When I got home, I placed her last letter back with the others and blew out the candle. The room fell into darkness, soft and full. And for once, I didn't reach for the light. Because some stories aren't meant to be continued. They're meant to be remembered. Tell me, have you ever waited for something so long that, when it never came, you realized the waiting itself had changed you? That's what her silence was. Not an ending. A quiet evolution. The radio came alive before dawn. I hadn't meant to turn it on. I'd been half asleep, half awake, the kind of gray hour when memory and dream blur together. Then the static shifted and a voice cut through the dark. This morning, German forces have crossed into France. I sat up. The room was cold, the faint smell of coffee lingering from last night. The announcer's tone was steady, almost reverent, like a priest delivering bad news with practiced calm. Paris prepares for air raids. Britain braces for invasion. Each word seemed to pull the air out of the room. The same voice that once carried baseball games and evening music now carried the end of an age. I stood by the window. Outside, the lake was still, gray, untroubled. Somewhere across that water, another sunrise touched cities already burning. It struck me how strange it is to feel peace and fear at the same time. To sip warm coffee while men thousands of miles away fight for their lives. My father shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. News again? I nodded. He didn't ask for details. Just sat down, listening to the hum. We'd both learned there's no comfort in too many facts. Sometimes it's better to feel the weight of silence than to fill it with noise. The broadcast went on. Troop movements, alliances, pleas for unity. Then, as if the announcer himself couldn't bear the monotony of tragedy, he paused and said quietly, "Wherever you are this morning, hold the people near you close." It wasn't part of the script. You could tell. And maybe that's why it felt like the truest thing said all day. I turned off the radio. The quiet that followed was thick, alive. The kind that makes you hear everything else more clearly, the whistle of the kettle, the creak of the floorboards, the heartbeat under your ribs. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then my father said, "You think it'll reach us?" "It already has," I replied. "Just slower." He looked at me then, the same look he'd given years ago during the worst of the Depression. A look that said, "We've survived before, we'll do it again." Later that day, I went to work at the yard. Even there, the air felt different. The men moved slower, quieter. Someone had brought a small radio, and though no one asked, everyone listened. When the announcer's voice cracked saying Paris has fallen, we stopped working. Hammers stilled midair. For a full minute, no one spoke. It wasn't fear that silenced us. It was grief. Grief for strangers, for history, for the fragile illusion that the world had learned something from the last time. That evening, walking home, I passed the post office. I almost went in to ask about any delayed mail from Arizona, but I didn't. Some silences are sacred. Sophie's was one of them. Instead, I walked to the lake again. The wind was colder now, carrying a hint of rain. I sat on the bench near the trees my father and I had planted. Their thin branches quivered in the wind but held firm. I imagined Sophie sitting in her desert schoolhouse, listening to her own radio, hearing the same words. Maybe she turned it off too. Maybe she stepped outside and looked up at the same indifferent stars. For a moment, I could almost hear her say it. "We are all lanterns to someone." And I thought, maybe that's all that's left when history turns to ash. Not victory, not nations, not even peace. Just light, small, human, passing from hand to hand in the dark. When I got home, my father was asleep again in his chair. I pulled a blanket over him, then turned the radio on one last time. The announcer's voice had softened now, giving way to music. A slow, fragile violin piece, the kind that feels older than the world itself. I sat down beside the radio, closed my eyes, and listened. And in that music, I heard everything. The dust storms, the laughter, the letters, the silence between heartbeats. A whole decade of surviving. Tell me, have you ever listened to something that broke your heart but made you believe in people again? That's what that night was. A broadcast from a world falling apart, and a reminder that even in ruin, someone is still singing. Spring came late that year. It crept into Chicago like someone afraid to knock. The lake stayed gray long after the calendar said it should shine again. Even the birds returned in hesitant flocks, as if testing whether the air was ready to forgive them. I hadn't been to the park since autumn. Work had swallowed most of my days, and the radio had swallowed most of my nights. But one Saturday I woke before dawn and just knew I needed to go. The sky was still the color of ash when I reached the lake. The path was slick with thawed snow, the air heavy with that faint metallic scent of new beginnings. And there they were, the trees. The ones my father and I had planted almost 2 years before, thin, trembling things back then, barely alive against the wind. Now they stood taller, their trunks firm, their branches tipped with buds that hadn't yet opened but promised to. I stood there a long while, gloved hands buried in my coat pockets, just looking. There was something in their stillness that made my chest tighten, a kind of quiet endurance that didn't need to be seen to matter. My father had always said trees were the best kind of people. They don't ask for much, he'd tell me, and they spend their whole lives giving back. He was right. Even now, in a world unraveling overseas, these trees had the nerve to bloom. I ran my hand along one of the trunks, feeling the ridges of bark, cool and rough. There was a small scar near the base, the mark where I'd carved 2 words the day we planted them. For tomorrow. The letters had faded, but they were still there, and somehow that felt enough. I sat on the bench nearby, the same one where my father and I had rested that first day. The city behind me buzzed faintly with life, but here, by the water, time slowed. Every ripple on the lake looked like a heartbeat. I thought of Sophie as I always did in the quiet. How she once wrote that the desert could teach patience better than any teacher. That everything worth growing takes its time. Maybe she was right. Maybe these trees weren't just trees. Maybe they were the world's quiet apology, proof that even after all we've broken, something still chooses to live. The sun rose higher, and the buds caught its light, tiny green flames along every branch. And for the first time in a long time, I felt warmth not as comfort, but as understanding. That survival isn't about winning. It's about enduring gently. A young couple passed by, pushing a baby carriage. They smiled at me, then at the trees. "Beautiful, aren't they?" the woman said. "They are," I replied. "They almost didn't make it." She looked surprised. Really? I nodded. They were planted in hard ground. Dry, frozen, cracked. But sometimes the hardest soil grows the strongest roots. She smiled again, the kind of smile that stays a little too long, and then they moved on. I watched them until they disappeared down the path. Something about them, their youth, their small child, reminded me of what I'd thought life would be once, and how differently it had turned out. But I wasn't sad, just grateful. Grateful that I'd lived long enough to see things grow again. When I left the park, I took one last look at the trees. They swayed in the wind, not defiant, not fragile, just present. And I realized something I hadn't before. We spend so much time waiting for the world to change, but maybe the world waits for us, for the moment we finally stop running and start noticing what's still alive. That afternoon, I told my father about the trees. He smiled, slow and proud. "Told you," he said, "they'd outlast us." "Maybe that's the point," I said, "to leave something that doesn't need us to survive." He nodded, then looked out the window at the faint green returning to the city. "Maybe so, but it still helps to check on them once in a while." That night, I lay awake listening to the wind move through the cracks in the window frame. It sounded almost like leaves rustling, almost like laughter far away, almost like peace. Tell me, have you ever gone back to a place that once broke you and found it gentler than you remembered? That's what that morning was. Not redemption, just quiet proof that healing happens. Slowly, silently, and sometimes even in the soil we thought was dead. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. No fanfare, no explanation, just a plain envelope slipped among the bills and advertisements. The paper was aged, yellow at the edges, the ink faded to a ghost of blue. When I saw the handwriting, my heart stopped. It was hers. Sophie. I turned the envelope over. The postmark was barely legible, March 1938, nearly 3 years ago. Somehow, the letter had vanished into the maze of war, post offices, rail lines, and found its way back through time to my hands. I sat down at the kitchen table and just stared at it. The world outside had moved on. The sound of streetcars, laughter, the faint song of a radio drifting through an open window, but inside, time folded. It felt like she was on the other side of that paper, waiting patiently, knowing I'd open it when I was ready. I broke the seal. "Dear Sam, the river's risen again. You like it, all muddy and loud and alive. The children have been helping me plant new willows near the bank. They keep asking if trees can remember. I tell them maybe not the way people do, but they remember through roots. Every flood, every drought, every season that passes through them becomes part of who they are. I hope you're doing the same, Sam. I hope you're letting the years shape you, not harden you. I keep thinking about the day you fixed the school roof. The sun was brutal that afternoon, but you didn't complain. You just kept working until it stopped leaking. That's how I picture you still, quiet, steady, fixing things no one else knows how to mend. If this letter finds you, remember, not everything that's lost stays gone. Some things just take the long way home. Sophie." I read it twice, then a third time until the words blurred. Then I laid it flat on the table and just breathed. The wind outside carried the scent of new leaves. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. The sound was sharp, bright, like the first green pushing through winter ground. I thought of her students, the way she described their laughter echoing through the desert air. Thought of the river she loved, muddy and stubborn, carving its way through rock and time. I realized then that her words had never stopped traveling. Even when her letters stopped coming, the things she taught me, patience, kindness, endurance, had kept moving through me, shaping the way I lived. Like the roots of those willows she'd written about, carrying the memory of seasons deeper than memory itself. I folded the letter carefully, pressed it to my chest for a moment, then looked toward the window. The sunlight had shifted, catching the leaves outside just right. They glowed gold green, trembling like tiny flames. For the first time in years, I felt her not as absence, but as presence, quiet, continuous, everywhere. In the trees, in the air, in the small acts of repair and care that make up an ordinary life. I wanted to write her back, though I knew the address no longer mattered. Still, I found a scrap of paper and wrote, "Sophie, your letter found me. You were right, not everything lost stays gone. The trees by the lake are growing. The city is softer now, and I'm still here fixing what I can. Thank you for finding your way home." I didn't mail it. I folded it into the old bundle of her letters, tied it with the same worn string, and placed it on the shelf beside my bed. Some nights, when the world feels too loud, I reach for that bundle, not to read, just to touch, to feel the weight of all those words that made me who I am. Tell me, have you ever found something long lost and realized it had been waiting for you all along? That's what that letter was. Not a message from the past, but a reminder that love, when true, doesn't vanish. It just takes the long way home. He'd been fading for weeks. Not suddenly, just quietly, the way light leaves a room at dusk. Each day a little dimmer. Each evening a little further away. The doctors called it congestive heart failure, but my father simply called it time catching up. He said it with that same dry humor that had carried him through every storm we'd lived through. I visited every evening after work. The hospital room was small but clean, smelling faintly of antiseptic and lilies. He hated the lilies, said they made him feel like he'd already left. So I brought wildflowers instead. Daisies sometimes. Once, a single branch from the trees we'd planted by the lake. When I placed it in a cup by his bed, his eyes softened. "Still growing?" he asked. I nodded. "Taller than me now." "Good," he murmured. "That's how it should be." We didn't talk about the war much. He listened to the radio sometimes, shaking his head, but he never said what he was thinking. He'd seen too many beginnings turn into endings to believe in victory anymore. That evening, the sky outside his window glowed the color of fading brass, that strange light between day and night, when everything seems to hold its breath. He was half asleep when I arrived, but opened his eyes when he heard my chair scrape. "Sam," he said slowly, voice thin but steady, "I was dreaming about the house you built me. You remember that?" I smiled. "It wasn't much of a house." He chuckled softly. "Didn't need to be. It was home. You know the difference now, don't you?" I nodded. I did. He looked at me for a long time after that. The kind of look that sees everything at once. The boy I was, the man I'd become, the years stretched between us like a bridge. "You did all right," he said finally. "Better than all right." I swallowed. "You too." He smiled faintly. "Took me long enough to learn what mattered." He turned his head toward the window. "See that light?" he asked. "That's what morning looks like from the other side." We sat in silence for a while. The air hummed with that quiet electricity hospitals always have, distant footsteps, the faint hiss of oxygen, someone laughing softly down the hall. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "You ever hear from her again?" It took me a moment to understand. "Sophie?" He nodded. I shook my head. "No, but I found one last letter. From years ago." His eyes brightened. "Then she did what she came to do." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a tired but knowing smile. "Some people don't stay to keep you company, son. They stay long enough to teach you how to keep going." His words settled in the room like dust in sunlight. Slow, inevitable, true. After that, he grew quiet again. His breathing shallowed, each inhale a little shorter, each exhale a little farther apart. I wanted to tell him things, everything, how much I owed him, how much of who I was came from him, how I never said thank you enough. But all I managed was, "I'll take care of the trees." He smiled faintly. "I know." The light outside had gone from brass to blue now. A nurse came in, checked his pulse, adjusted something by the bed, then left. He closed his eyes again. "Sam," he whispered. "Yeah. You keep fixing things, you hear? Don't matter if they break again. The world needs people who keep trying." His hand twitched. I reached out and held it. It was cold but not lifeless. Just tired. I sat there long after he fell asleep, the room dim except for the lamp by his bed. I didn't cry. There was no need. Because grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the quiet knowing that you were loved well, and that you'll spend the rest of your life passing that love forward. When I left, the nurse nodded softly. She didn't need to say anything. Outside, the city was still alive. Cars moved, children laughed somewhere in the distance, and the wind carried the faint scent of spring rain. I looked up. The stars were out again, bright, indifferent, eternal, and I whispered into the night, "Rest easy, old man. I'll keep fixing things." Tell me, have you ever said goodbye without words? The kind where silence speaks louder than tears? That's what that night was. Not an ending. Just the passing of light from one lantern to another. The years folded themselves neatly like old linen. I grew older quietly, the way wood darkens with time. Not sudden, not sorrowful, just honest. Work came and went. Friends did too. And one by one, the days shaped me into something I hadn't planned to become but somehow always was. A man who fixed things. The war ended. The city rebuilt. Children grew where rubble had been. The trees by the lake, our trees, became landmarks people used to give directions. Turn left at the tall oaks, they'd say, never knowing they once fit in the crook of my arm. I hadn't been there in years. Not since my father passed. But one spring morning, when the air smelled of wet soil and lilacs, I felt a pull. A whisper. A memory saying it's time. The park looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown too large with time. The trees were enormous now, their roots curling deep into the earth, their branches touching the sky like prayer. Underneath them, the grass was thick and bright. I ran my hand along the trunk of the nearest one. The scar was still there, faint but legible. For tomorrow. Made me smile. I'd carved those words with a hand that still believed tomorrow was a place you could reach if you walked far enough. Now I knew better. Tomorrow isn't a destination. It's the way you keep walking. I sat on the same bench where my father once rested. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and children laughed somewhere nearby. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it had been. The rhythm of waves, the smell of sap, the echo of his voice in the wind. The world needs people who keep trying. I closed my eyes and breathed. I could almost hear Sophie too, somewhere beyond time, reading from one of her letters. Not everything lost stays gone. Some things just take the long way home. The two voices, one from the earth, one from the wind, met in the space between breaths. And I understood then, nothing truly disappears. Not people. Not love. Not the things we build with care. A young man walked by with a toolbox slung over his shoulder. He nodded to me politely, maybe seeing something familiar in my worn hands. "Working today?" he asked with a grin. "Always," I said. "There's always something to fix." He laughed and kept walking. I watched him go, his steps light, his back straight, and thought, that's how it continues. The sky deepened into gold. Birds perched along the branches of our trees, singing with that careless joy only spring allows. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not pride, not nostalgia. Because I finally understood what my life had been about. Not the buildings, not the repairs, not even the letters that crossed the desert. It was about holding things together long enough for someone else to take over. We don't get to choose how long we're part of the story. We just make sure the story doesn't end while we're here. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Sophie's last letter. Edges frayed, folds soft from being opened too many times. The ink was barely visible now, but the words still lived in me. I didn't need to read them anymore. Instead, I whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Dad. You both taught me how to build things that last, even out of dust." The sun slipped lower, laying light across the water like liquid gold. I sat there until the world turned quiet again. The trees rustled softly above me, their leaves whispering secrets I could almost understand. And for the first time in a long, long life, I felt ready to rest. Tell me, if your hands could build one thing to outlive you, what would it be? A house? A tree? A story? Because maybe that's all any of us are doing. Carpenters of dust, shaping the fragile into the forever. The circle closes, softly, without sadness. The man who once wandered through ruin leaves behind trees, silence, and the echo of kindness that built him.